So I did martyrs for my project, my essay, and I guess what I was mostly interested in the martyrs was why and who. So I really kind of started looking at what it meant to be a martyr and what it did in the context of why people did it and what it meant to do it, things like that. So I looked at Polycarp, Perpetua, Cyprian, Ignatius, the Martyrs of Lyons, and chapter 18 of our Paganism and Christianity book, and then a few smaller accounts that I looked at just for background and things like that. But the ones I listed off are the ones that I got a lot of information out of and were mostly helpful. So I started reading them, and I guess I started looking at them in the form of storytelling, because they all seem to follow a very similar track, and it's very similar to when you start looking at fairy tales and kind of other mythology things. You start noticing patterns, and this was very helpful in the idea of who becomes a martyr and how they become a martyr and what it kind of means to become a martyr. So, first thing I noticed was that there were certain traits that martyrs had to have. It seemed really impossible to find a bad guy that would be a martyr. So I noticed that they had to be educated. They had to be strong in conviction, but not necessarily physically strong. And we see that with Blandina, who was described as very thin and very weak, and people were really worried about whether or not she'd be able to withstand her passion. They had to be selfless, humble, and they had to go through some kind of conversion, and that usually happened very early on in the account. And by that I mean that they're either not a Christian or are not very intense about their faith yet. But then all of a sudden they start kind of getting into it. So Polycarp and Cyprian were really good examples of this. They were both educated, and then all of a sudden were learning the scripture, and then becoming bishops and following the scripture. And usually that was marked by them. They give away their worldly possessions. So I think Cyprian gave it everything away. So they had to be humble and modest. I mentioned that, and usually that was shown through some kind of praise. Like the people would praise the future martyr, and the future martyr would be like, "Oh, no, thank you. Don't say those things to me. I'm not worth it," kind of stuff. But we all know that they were awesome. We all know that. So that's the beginning of the formula. That was a pretty consistent trait. We didn't really see that with Perpetua, because her account is a diary, and we don't really see how she became a Christian, or her necessarily giving up a lot. But I guess you could say with Thecla, even though I didn't mention her in my essay, she definitely gave up a lot to follow Paul. I guess you could see that as the mark of her becoming a devout Christian. So the next part that I noticed was that they're usually exiled or imprisoned after they're found out. Someone finds them as a Christian, and they basically give themselves up. They don't fight anymore, and that is shown in several of the texts, especially in Paganism and Christianity. I think we talked in class about how you can't just give yourself up, but once you're found out, you have to go willingly. So once that happens, the martyr is usually exiled, imprisoned, withheld, or some kind of restraint where they're apart from everyday society, a very kind of secluded, quiet atmosphere. We see that with Cyprian, Polycarp, Thecla, everybody. But what's important that happens when they're in this seclusion is, they have a few followers around with them, because they just seem to, draw people to them. So they have, a few followers that kind of hang out with them for a long time, pray with them. But usually what happens, and I'm pretty sure that this is mostly universal throughout the Martyr Stories. I mean, there's definitely going to be certain ones that don't have this, depending on their formula, but the basic formula seems to be that while they're in seclusion, they have a revelation, they have a vision of their death, their martyrdom. And this is very important. This is kind of like the turning point for them. This is their calling and their epiphany, and from that point on, they have no ties to life or this world or anything really except for God, and it's the beginning of their relationship with God and their spiritual side, and it's also the beginning of them being seen as a Christ figure. And so without this turning point, this is like the first, if you think about it in a narrative sense, this is the first climax, the first top point for plot, and then it kind of goes down and then it comes back up at the end. But if that makes any sense to anyone. But so this is the turning point for everything. So the revelation that they have is they're getting the sacred knowledge, and we've seen in the past, and we've discussed how in the Gospel of Truth, and I think the Apocryphon of John, knowledge is this spiritual elite thing. It kind of separates you from the pack. It kind of is a marker of just a really spiritual person, someone who has a very special relationship with God, while being bound to material feelings and objects is seen as being lowly and not worth God's attention, almost. You have to engage in this relationship with God. And the martyrs, during their epiphany, that's what they're doing. That's their calling. God is calling on them to become a martyr. So because of this, they don't have that connection to their body anymore. I think I mentioned that. But it's very important, because without this revelation, then they would still dwell on their body and dwell on the earth and dwell on how they're leaving all of their friends and all their objects behind. So without this epiphany, we wouldn't have the martyrs, because they wouldn't be able to withstand and have that ability to become something holy, because they'd still be attached to the earth, as it were. So an interesting detail that I noticed that usually comes directly after this, well, not completely directly, but pretty soon after. I didn't talk about it in my essay, because I couldn't really fit it in, but it really interests me, so I just want to mention it, that it seems that as the martyrs are being let out, they're usually stripped of their clothing, or they take